It is 4 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time here, and it is time for our noted historian, author, and lecturer who has been researching the conspiratorial view of history for over 50 years. He has written or produced 4 best-selling books entitled The Unseen Hand, The New World Order, Conspiracy Against Christianity, Jesse James, United States Senator, 6 booklets and 15 DVDs. And one of these days, I'm actually going to update that because that's not exactly accurate. He has more booklets and DVDs. But right now, we're going to bring on my favorite historian, Ralph Epperson, and welcome him to Politics and Prophecy this week. So, how are you today, Ralph?
I'm doing fine, Chris. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity. Let me just turn my fan down. You caught me unaware. Just a second. It's in what we call our monsoon season, where it's very hot and humid. Although it's not real hot, it's in the 90s, but it's warm, so I got fans going. I have a completely different view of John McCain, although I want to make it abundantly clear, in my opinion, he was not an American. He betrayed his own nation, and I'm going to document that today because he could have learned what was really happening in Vietnam and how his airplane was shot down by our ally Russia. That's something that no one in this nation is talking about, as far as I know. So we're going to learn a great deal about McCain today as being not a hero, but a reprobate. He was guilty of treason, and that's what I want to talk about, if that's okay with you.
That's fine. Just take it away, brother.
Let me start with this. To understand, well, let's go back to the very first time I met John McCain. I live in Arizona, of course, and have since 1976. I was born and raised here in Arizona, and then left and came back in 1976. And the first time I met him was in 1984. I was a member of a group called the Saturday Morning Breakfast Club, and there were maybe 30 of us at this first meeting, one of the early meetings we had, and Congressman John McCain came as a guest. And the Breakfast Club always had a habit of allowing the members, to ask questions of the speaker. So I got up on the mic, and I asked John, what role does the Constitution play in your decisions on whether to vote for a particular bill? And John McCain answered, quote, if I voted the Constitution, government would be a lot smaller. And then he laughed. Thought that was funny. Ha ha. No, I don't vote the Constitution because if I did, I couldn't do what I wanted to do. Now, I believe he knew that I think you and I have talked about this. I think he knew that he had total unlimited power, and that he could vote any way he jolly well wanted to because of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. And that's the way he answered it. But he thought it was funny to vote the Constitution, which means limited government. I want to read a letter that he wrote me personally. The letter explains the whole circumstances about the letter. It was written from Congress, as he was a member of Congress, on October the 13th, 1986. Dear Ralph, a mutual friend of ours, and I won't name him, he's named in the letter, a mutual friend of ours recently sent me a copy of your book, The Unseen Hand. I would like to thank you very much for inscribing the book to me. I wrote in there to Congressman McCain, I hope this book will be of educational value, do something like that, signed A. Ralph Epperson. It was very thoughtful of you, and listen to this. I look forward to reading your book with great interest. Again, thanks for thinking of me. I don't believe he ever read the book, because if he did, he would learn an awful lot, especially about Vietnam, that he fought in that war and why he was a prisoner of war. So he didn't. Now, sometime later, maybe, 10, 12 years later, maybe in about 2005, it's been 8 or 10 years ago, Megan McCain, his daughter, the one that's, you see pictures of him, and she's on The View now. She wrote to me on Facebook and said, what a fine conservative you are. So apparently she was I would guess, a doctrinaire conservative. So we started talking, and I didn't realize who she was until she mentioned her last name. She just said Megan. So she's the daughter of John McCain, and I was stunned. So I tried to arrange a meeting with her so I'd like to talk to her. Well, we didn't get that far, but I mentioned my book, The Unseen Hand. And so she says, I think my father has a copy of that book. It's in his library. And I would presume it was covered with dust and cobwebs because I don't think Daddy read the book. So I said, Megan, by all means, please read the book and then get back to me. Well, I never heard from her again, which means I think she tried to read the book and realized she didn't want to know this, just like her father. Now let's read about what it was that he would have learned if he had read the book. And I want to go back to Senator to page 311 of the book. I've got it in front of me, The Unseen Hand. Those of you that have a copy, get a copy out as well, because we're going to talk about what he would have learned if he had read the book in 1986. I want to go back to my discussion of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Everybody in the world hates McCarthy. I'm going to tell you why the United States hates Senator McCarthy, because he knew there was a conspiracy. Let me read from his own writings. This is now me talking. McCarthy also told the American people that it was at the Yalta Conference in 1945. Now, you might remember as the war was ending, Roosevelt and then later Truman and Winston Churchill and first of all Chiang Kai-shek, and he was later not invited anymore, and Joseph Stalin sat down and planned the world. And listen to what he said. It was in 1945 that Roosevelt and Stalin planned not only the Korean War that the United States was then involved in, but also the Vietnamese War that was to follow some 10 to 12 years later. Did you understand what I just said? These three men sat down and planned the war in 1945. The Vietnamese War. We were not at war in Vietnam then. It was on September the 23rd, 1950, that McCarthy charged. And listen to this. Here was signed the death warrant of the young men who were dying today in the hills and valleys of Korea. Here was signed the death warrant of the young men who will die tomorrow in the jungles of Vietnam, end quote. McCarthy was warning us this war was planned and it was going to happen and young men were going to die, and McCain went. Now, of course, he wouldn't have known about the book until 86, but McCain went and flew his airplane. Now, let's talk about other things that are also pertinent because the Vietnamese War was planned. Let's go back. If the North Vietnamese by themselves had not involved themselves with Russia and Red China, other communist nations, and started a war, they would have been on the backs of oxen, meaning oxes, and then they'd throw spears at each other. But since we planned the war, we were going to have a 20th century war. We're going to have airplanes and jets and rockets and missiles and rifles and Air Force bases and navies and things fighting each other. Now, let's talk about that. The plan was there are only two nations in the world who would supply such technology. Russia would supply the North, and the United States would supply the South. And that was the plan. Of course, that would be communism versus capitalism. But then, listen to this. Russia was sent war-making technology by the United States. I'm going to prove that. And McCain went to that war. Now, he maybe didn't know this. I don't know. But once he got back, he could have learned about it and told the American people the truth. And we could have had some relief for the fact that our own government planned the war and then sent the enemy the materials to kill him. Now, let's talk about John McCain personally. Let me get the exact dates here. John McCain, here, hold on, it's down here. Here it is. Let me give you one little article to prove that. This is an article that appeared in my newspaper in 1989, so it's many years after the war ended. Soviet Army, our ally, because we were sending them war-making technology. They were our ally in the war because we were fighting both sides. We were supplying both sides of the war. So they also fought in Vietnam. Now listen to this. Soviet soldiers and technicians took part in missile launching combat and shot down U.S. aircraft. This is our ally. Don't forget, we're sending him technology, which might very well have included air-to-air missiles. But I can't prove that. But let me tell you what we do know. This report focused on the summer of 1965. Okay, let me finish. When American warplanes were engaged in extensive bombing in North Vietnam, these Russian experts shot down 24 planes. 24. They fired 43 missiles and downed 23 planes. And I believe John McCain's plane was one of them. October the 26th, 1967, McCain's plane went down. He shot out. Now, I guess it's possible they could have fired a pistol into it. I don't believe so. I think one of these missiles, because it was only 2 years later after when we learned. By the way, I also knew a POW who was in the Vietnam, what they call the Hanoi Hilton, the POW camp, was there. He was also from Arizona. He was also a lieutenant colonel who flew some airplane and was shot down as well. And I asked him, did you know that the Russians were firing missiles at you? And he said, yes. I said, how did you know that? He said, we were briefed by our Air Force intelligence before we flew every time to look out for missile sites on the ground that were going to fire at us. So what did you do? He said, well, we tried to avoid those missile sites. Now, wait a minute. We were told under the rules of engagement we could not knock those missile sites down, even though the day before, maybe even this pilot had lost one of his fellow pilots from a Russian missile. And John McCain flew his airplane into that and apparently allowed it to happen because he flew too close, I guess, and had a Russian ally shoot down his own airplane. So he spent 6 years or 5 years in the POW camp. Now let me finish with this. Listen to what Mr. Senator McCarthy said, and then we'll know now why McCarthy was destroyed by this conspiracy. Listen to what he said. How can we account for our present situation, this is 1950, unless we believe that men high in government are concerting to deliver us to disaster? This must be the product of a great conspiracy, a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man. What can be made of this unbroken series of decisions and also contributing to the strategy of defeat? They cannot be attributed to incompetence. The laws of probability would dictate that part of the decisions would serve this country's interests. In other words, it wasn't by chance. Now let's finish with this. Now, I want to talk about the fact that our government knew Russia was supplying the American government was supplying materials to the Vietnamese and from Russia. We were sending it directly to Russia, and they were in turn using it to kill Americans. The 1917 U.S. Trading with the Enemies Act, 1917 U.S. Trading with Enemies Act forbids U.S. firms or their foreign subsidiaries from trading with enemies of the United States except under license. The ability to grant the necessary licenses has been given by the Congress of the United States to the President with the option to delegate this authority to such departments as he deems appropriate. The president had the power to stop it by himself. He didn't need to go to Congress. He didn't need to get the American people to vote on it or to the Democrats or the Republicans to vote on it. He could have stopped it. And we'll get into that in a minute. So the presidents have delegated this authority to the Department of Commerce. That means the president has the authority to assume the direct responsibility should he or she choose to do so. President Nixon, after his election, had the authority to prevent the sale of any commodity he deemed to be against the nation's security interests. He could have honored both his party's platform and his campaign promises should he have chosen to do so after the election. Now let's go back to the 1968 presidential election. Of course, McCain was in a POW camp, so he didn't know about this, I presume. The Republicans, this is me writing in my book on page 340 in The Unseen Hand, President candidate Nixon also addressed himself to a plank in the Republican platform when he told the American Legion Convention in September of that year, 68, quote, there should be no aid or credits of any kind with any country, including the Soviet Union, that aids the enemy in Vietnam. Now, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? That's perfectly moral, constitutional, rational, and right. We don't want to trade with the people who are trading with the enemy to kill Americans. So he said that at the American Legion Convention. And when I said this once in a speech someplace in this country years ago, someone in the audience stood up and said, Ralph, I want you to know I was there when he said it. I remember him saying it. I was in the American Legion Convention. Now let's finish. The platform had the same plank. So now we know that he had the authority to do this. So now let's see whether or not President Nixon delivered on the promises made by candidate Nixon. During the let's see now. Here we go. Let's say this first. In 1969, during the middle of the Vietnamese War, when Americans were being killed by the Russian-supplied North Vietnamese, Congressman Earl Landgraf of Indiana introduced an amendment to the Export Control Act, that's the one that gives Nixon the authority solely, to put an end to it. The amendment read in part, no commodities, military or otherwise, should be authorized for shipment to any foreign nation which sells or furnishes to North Vietnam or which permits ships or aircraft under its registry to transport to or from Vietnam any equipment, materials, or commodities, or gives any form of assistance to North Vietnam. We're not going to allow it. And the amendment was defeated. Huh? What? Why would they do that? Why would Congress do that? They knew that we were supplying Russia with the technology to kill Americans and to shoot down McCain's airplane. Now, that's all I'm going to say about McCain until later, but let's just leave it at that. His plane was shot down by probably an American missile supplied to Russia. Okay, now let's go into let's see, I guess that was it. Okay, by the way, I put this together so quickly, I didn't get it. Okay, here we go. Now let me document the fact that our government knowingly supplied the Russians, and the Vietnamese government. Listen to this. Someplace along the line during the war, I learned about a report called the Export Control Bulletin, issued quarterly by the Department of Commerce, and it was to the President, the Senate, and the House Representatives. Now, I want to tell you a quick little story about that. It's interesting. I called in once on a talk show when I was in Oregon, and my congresswoman was Edith Green, I think her name was. So she's on the air, and I said, Congresswoman, I want to whisper this because I don't want anybody to know this, but I have in my hands a top secret report that only a few can get, that I have a copy of, and I'm going to read from it because it's a report on how our government sold Russia technology during the Vietnamese War to kill Americans. We sold it to Russia, which in turn were sent to kill Americans. She said, what? I said, no, I'm not joking, Congresswoman. This is a serious report, and I'm going to reveal to you some things we allowed American businessmen to sell to the Russians during that one quarter alone. Third quarterly report, 1971. These are things that we sent to Russia, and by the way, it does not tell us who sent it. It only tells us how much. We sent them electronic computers, foundry and metalworking equipment, parts for rolling mills. Rolling mills make steel. Ball and roller bearings. Now, what on earth are we sending them ball and roller bearings when they use them in missiles and rockets and tanks and armored personnel carriers and large weapons that have to be rolled with wheels? We sent them the latest ability, in fact, the real ball bearings. Why? During the war, we're selling ball bearings to Russia, yes. We sent them transmissions and parts. I found out later that we were selling tank transmissions to Russia from General Motors, and those transmissions were put in tanks that were sent to the North Vietnamese to kill Americans. General Motors was doing this. Oh, thank you very much. And it was allowed by President Nixon. Airborne navigation equipment. Apparently, the Russian airplanes were flying into mountains with the hills of Vietnam, so we sent them the latest technology in airborne navigation equipment. We sent them $11 million of heavy-duty trucks and parts. When we were blowing up trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a jungle trail that was used by the North Vietnamese to get supplies down to the South Vietnamese when their soldiers were in that area. So we sent them 11 men. Oil well drilling equipment. Now, what would we do that for? So the Russians could get oil and send it down there to feed their tanks and the gasoline and everything else. So we sent that. Aircraft testing instruments. We want to make sure the airplanes will fly long enough to shoot down other airplanes of the Americans. We sent them technical data, which I presume was the blueprints or maybe patents for iron and steel foundries for producing automobile engines, lube oil additives, and the distillation of petroleum. Huh? Wait a minute. Why was this going on? Now, here's my only objection to John McCain. When he came back, he could have read my book and read what I just covered. And he could have learned that this was going on. And he said, Ralph, I read your book. Please help me document that. I'm going to the American people to tell them that it was our own government that shot my airplane down and killed 58,000 of my fellow fighting men. He didn't do it. Why? Why? Now, let me read you what the Constitution says about this. Hold on, I'm going to read it word for word. I had it here a minute ago someplace. Here it is, the Constitution. Let's read this. Here's what it says. Now, this is one of the only few words in the Constitution that's actually defined. Listen to this. Article 3, Judicial Department. We divided our Congress into three parts: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. This is the legislative, judicial department. Section 3, Article 3, Section 3. Treason against the United States shall consist in only levying war against them, or, remember the word or, because we're going to cover that in a minute. So it's A or B, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. In other words, you could be an enemy without going to war against us. You don't have to declare war, have the Russians declare war on us. They were our enemy in Vietnam because they were aiding the North Vietnamese, and we were aiding them. That means that Nixon and Johnson both were guilty of first-degree premeditated murder by committing treason when they knew this was going on. They permitted it. to go on. Attempts to stop it by there's one other bill, I can't think of it right now, it's not in my book, but there was another bill introduced, I think a year later, to stop it, and that was also defeated by our Congress. Now, my point is this. Let me finish with this. I have a copy of a petition. This particular one was issued beginning on July 4th, but it goes back to 1967, the very year that McCain's airplane was shot down. It was a petition to stop this aid and trade, to stop it. We went to the people of the United States, a nationwide organization, went to the people and said, we're going to stop this, and we're going to start a petition and drive, and then we're going to send these petitions to Congress and the President in groups of 10,000. In other words, we'll walk in the door and say, we got 10,000 signatures telling you to stop this aid and trade, and we've given out 4 million signatures. The largest petition drive up to that date, at least, ever in this nation. But it didn't work. Why? Why didn't it work? Why didn't they listen? Why didn't our congressman listen in Arizona? I went to it was Jim Colby was our congressman. I think this was after the war, and I asked him why he didn't do something to stop it. He didn't know anything about it. And I said, Congressman, let me read you. I didn't mention Congressman Green. I said, Congressman, I have a report. I said, I'll read you the cover. It says a report issued to the Congress of the United States and the Senate and the President. It's issued to you, and you never read it, did you? And he said, no. I said, well, all this was going on while you were a congressman. We were selling technology to Russia to kill Americans, and you didn't know about it? Well, that was the end of that question. So I'm saying some serious charges here. The thing that bothers me most about John McCain is that he had a chance to know and that he didn't know. Now, let me finish. Well, I want to have some more things to say. Let me say this. This report. When I discovered it, I put it into my DVD called Vietnam, America's Betrayal and Treason. I made that in 1987, I think the first year I did it. It was way after the war was over. So I actually held the report up and quoted from it and put those words on the screen so the viewer can see what we were selling Russia to kill Americans in the war in Vietnam. And so I discussed, so later on, sometime later, I said, I'm going to go to the U of A library, University of Arizona. I was a graduate there. And the library is open to anyone that's a taxpayer can go in the library and actually walk amongst the shelves and pick up a book and take it to a desk and sit down and read it. I couldn't check it out, but I could read it while I was there and make copies of it if I wished. So I went to these reports and I read all of them. Now, this was the 95th one, so maybe there was 100 of them at that time. So I read every one of them and listed the products that we sold in that particular report. So for some reason, I went back a couple of years later maybe to check something, and I went to the area where they were shown on the shelf. And so I went to the lady and I said, they're not there. Did they move them? Oh, no. We were told by the printing office Department of Commerce to destroy those reports. Destroy them? Yes. What reason did they give you? Because there was a lack of space. Now, I estimated each one of these reports at about a quarter-inch thick. They're not very big. So they're 8.5, 11 by folded over, so it's a half size, and then there's a quarter-inch thick, and you put these side by side on the shelf, and it takes maybe 3 or 4 feet. The U of A library was 5 stories plus a basement and a wing of 3 stories, so they had plenty of space, but they destroyed them, the U of A did. So I went and called Arizona State. Maybe they didn't get the order. So I called them, and they too were ordered to destroy these reports. And then I called the state capitol. They also had these reports, and they were ordered to destroy these reports. Now, there was only one person talking about them in the entire United States, and that was little Ralph Epperson and those who watched my DVDs. Somebody didn't like that I was making this public. So somebody destroyed them. I don't know if they ever reprinted them or not, or whether you can even buy them today, but I know that they destroyed all of them because somebody was making something public that he wasn't supposed to make. So little Ralph Epperson did what he could to stop this madness, but of course nobody listened.
Facts are incredibly insulting to liberals. You have to understand that, okay? And I say all the time, facts don't care about your feelings, and that just sends them into a more downward spiral. So you cannot hit them with facts. That's the worst thing you can hit them with, actually.
You are listening to Politics and Prophecy with Chris Levels on freedomizerradio.com. And we're back for the second part of this interview with Ralph Epperson as he's talking about the Vietnam War and John McCain. So I'll just let you continue on, Ralph.
Well, I've only got a couple more things, Chris, and then if you want to talk about what you suggest, that'd be fine. I didn't mention that Senator McCarthy, once we learned about what he believed was going on, a conspiracy so enormous it dwarfs every other conspiracy in the world, the decision was made in the Eisenhower White House. He gathered all the people that should know about how we could stop McCarthy and label him to be a crackpot. It's interesting. McCarthy named something like 200 communists, and the liberal left said that he was blaming these innocent people. Every one of the names that he named were later found out to be members of the Communist Party. So McCarthy was vindicated, but it doesn't matter. He was labeled as a crackpot, saying all these vicious things about these poor people who were blacklisted and everything else. So he was a real hero. By the way, McCarthy was poisoned. He apparently had a drinking problem, and they got him into Bethesda Naval Hospital because he was, of course, a senator, and I guess he could go there, or maybe even a military World War II veteran. So if you could get him under a oxygen tent and pump something into there, some vapor, he would breathe it and it would kill him, and that's what happened to McCarthy. He was murdered by our own government as well. So McCarthy was really a hero who saw a conspiracy so immense it dwarfed everything in the past. And now we know why the world hates Senator McCarthy. He was doing his part to expose what this conspiracy was and is, and by naming names and what they were doing, and so we had to destroy McCarthy. Secondly, I think I just wanted to mention that report that I was using was the petition drive was done by the John Birch Society, and it wasn't the AFL-CIO, it wasn't the American Legion, it wasn't the Veterans of Foreign Wars, it wasn't CBS News or NBC News, it wasn't the Congress, it wasn't the Senate, it wasn't the media. One group decided to try to stop it, and of course it was unsuccessful, but they tried. And let me end with this last comment. When I was touring the country in 85 to 87, one time as I was touring, I went city to city. I went to Washington, D.C., and the man who picked me up at the airport took the afternoon off and said, "How would you like to see the city?" I said, "Love to." So we went and we were driving around. I saw the Lincoln Memorial, one of the few sites that I recognized from just being an American. So I said, "Oh, I want to go see Lincoln." I had nothing but great admiration for Lincoln. So we parked the car, walked up the steps, and went inside the big room, and it's just a huge, as you can, if you can picture the monument, it's a big statue, a seated statue of Lincoln sitting there, just immense, and you feel the power of this great man in my mind. So I stood there and watched and read the things on the wall, and as we walked out down the steps we had just walked up, I noticed the Vietnamese wall across the street. It's apparently in that area where they have all these rallies, etc. So we walked over there, and I walked the entirety of that wall. The names are chiseled in on there, and I don't remember it being two-sided. It might have been, but whatever it was, I walked the entire wall. And I want you to know, Chris, I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried. I cried like a baby because, in conclusion, I knew who killed those 58,000 men. It wasn't the Viet Cong. It wasn't the North Vietnamese. It wasn't the Russian government. It was the American government that allowed to get us, first of all, get us into that war in at least 1945. And the warning from McCarthy that we were going to be in war in Vietnam in a matter of 10 or 12 years, he was right. It was our own government that murdered him. Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson were guilty of treason as defined by the Constitution. And I cried like a baby because I didn't know one name on that wall. I did not know of any of my classmates in high school. None of us, maybe some of them went through, but I was either too young or too old for that war, so I was probably too old. So I didn't have to go. But it was, I'm sorry, I even when I talk about it now, I remember those moments. It was not very pleasant because I cried. I read the names of 58,000 men and women who died in that war. And it's just a tragic day in our past. And I'm disappointed in McCain, who could have been the nationwide leader to expose this nonsense, especially since he was there for 5 years and our own government shot down his airplane. He might want to do something about it, but he didn't want to read the book or get back in touch. Okay, I think that's enough. If you want to talk about what you want, the shooting or something you mentioned. Chris, are you there? Chris,
I'm sorry. I was on mute. Put myself on mute.
Okay.
No, I did want to talk about that. But now, since you have gone into this, speaking about our cooperation with the Russians, over the weekend, I watched a documentary called The Bomb, and it's speaking about. Actually, it was very, very interesting. It talked about how we didn't have to, well, certain people were saying that we didn't have to use the bomb because Japan had agreed to surrender and with the condition that they were allowed to keep the emperor, and that offer had been on the table for some time before we used the bomb. But we wanted to use it. We had sunk $2 billion in today's dollars into the project, and that there were people in government that wanted to not let that go to waste. And the thing is about it, because we've had the discussion where I've watched your documentary about the Russians don't have, or the United States is the only country to have nuclear weapons. It was very interesting because they documented, they didn't say anything about the Rosenbergs in this, but they did talk about a scientist named Fuchs. I can't remember his first name, Fuchs, that was a spy for the Russians that gave them, supposedly, now this would go against your hypothesis, but they said that him and another scientist, I can't remember his name at all, but were integral in giving the Soviets the technology for the bomb. And of course, I was thinking about you, but I was wondering, I was going to ask you, as I was watching this, I was thinking about you the whole time, because they made such a compelling case that yes, indeed, the Russians did have it, but they got all their technology and the means to do it from the United States. And even when I think about today in the Uranium One scandal, where we gave all that uranium to the Russians, how does that fit into your theory?
Well, let's go back to what you just said. Let's go back to the building of the thing. It was called the Manhattan Project. And they did indeed develop the atomic bomb in something like a couple of 3 years, like from 42 to 45. They've developed two different bombs. So we had two different bombs to drop. And you're right. By the way, this is all covered in The Unseen Hand and also in my DVD. I documented this. They had two bombs, and so we had to drop two of them. And our government knew that Japan was trying to surrender. Before the bombs were dropped, they were dropped anyway on the decision of Harry Truman to drop them. He could have prevented it, but he didn't. So we burned to death in radiation with thousands of Japanese in those two cities. So now, after the war's over, we did allow Japan to surrender, and we did allow them to keep their emperor. I just watched the story of General MacArthur and in the story, he did agree to allow them to keep their emperor as long as he had no power. And that's what the American government did when they took over the government of Japan to set it into the western side of the philosophy. So, but let's go back. There's more to the story, and as long as you brought it up, let's talk about it, if you don't mind. There was a thing called Lend-Lease, where we sent Russia $11 billion of American technology, war-making technology, so that they could conquer the Germans in the east. Germany invaded Russia from like Germany and Poland. They went east, and they were actually conquering the Russians until this Lend-Lease showed up, and we lent or leased equipment to them so that they could build their army, and then they started conquering the Germans and swept to the west. So now, during that thing, a American major in the Army, Major George Racy Jordan, was put in charge of the expediting, making sure it all went through Great Falls, Montana. It was an Air Force base, I think, and he was stationed there to make sure everything, when it came in, it was recorded, and it was sent on American airplanes to fly from Great Falls, Montana to Alaska, and then Alaska, they'd get out of the airplane, a Russian pilot would come over and fly the same airplane over to Russia, unload it, bring it back to Anchorage, and then he'd get out, and an American pilot would fly it back to Great Falls, Montana. Now, Major Jordan was ordered not to read or conquer or keep notes, but he didn't. He actually kept copies of bills of lading and documented, put in his own diary, things that we sent. And we sent them all of the materials and 1/2 of our then uranium supply. He saw it. He saw words like cadmium and hot water and uranium and cobalt and all these terms. He had no idea what they were in 43, 44. But he did keep track and records. So when the atomic bomb was allegedly exploded in 1949 by Russia, he then came public and made it public in a congressional hearing, and they said he was crazy. So he produced his records, and now we know that they did send it. Now, secondly, our government tried the Rosenbergs. Now, I do not know I don't remember how they learned about it or could have learned about it, but they tried them in court with an American jury for sending the supplies or the equipment, or at least the plans, to Russia during the war. They were tried and later executed within I think in 1952 or something like that. Both of them were executed. Their children claimed they were innocent. But let me finish. There's one more corroborating documentation for the fact that we sent Russia the ability to make the atomic bomb, and that came from James Roosevelt, the son of the president. He was a major in the United States Army. His commander-in-chief was his father, but more importantly, he was the president of the United States. So he called James into Washington, D.C., and told him to transfer the technology under the Lend-Lease program through to Russia to build the atomic bomb. So now, here's an interesting question. The Rosenbergs were tried for doing that. They were executed, tried and found guilty and executed. Roosevelt and his son did it, and neither one of them were tried and executed. Why? Why? The book that James wrote is called A Family Matter. And when I was in the place where Roosevelt had his home, someplace in New York City, outside of New York City, someplace on Long Island, as I remember. I went to visit during the day that I was to speak that night. The friend that brought me there let me take his car and go find it, and I visited. And I looked in their library. They sold all the books about Roosevelt, but the book written by James was not for sale. I wonder why. But James wrote it. It's called A Family Matter. You can read it yourself. So they gave it. Now, in 1949, Russia allegedly exploded the atomic bomb, but I can find no proof that they did. In fact, Harry Truman, I documented this. Harry Truman said they didn't explode the atomic bomb. And that's because they didn't have one. They didn't know what to do with this stuff. And they still don't know. And the people controlling Russia are not going to let them have the atomic bomb to put an end to that whole story.
Well,
so little Ralphie did what he could to get that. Yeah, way back in the 80s.
The thing is that what I don't understand, you said they didn't know what to do with it, but Fuchs, according to the story, gave them all the technology. So how would they not know what to do with, in fact, all the mistakes, because there was so much money that was spent and industries that built up, including at Los Alamos. A whole industry was built around the nuclear manufacture of weapons. So if we had to go through all this trial and error, which we did, and yet you have a guy on the inside that's telling, allowing the Soviets not to make the same mistakes and go through the trial and error, well, why wouldn't they be able to know what to do with the technology that was given to them?
Well, you can remember, if you watch my DVD, Chris, I'll remind you of a scene. There was a picture I found in Soviet Life magazine of Gorbachev addressing 60, 75, 80, something like 82 or something, addressing all of the communists and the Politburo, all members of them. They were all sitting in bleachers on the stage. The stage was in an auditorium, and the thing was huge, and the stage must have been probably 100 or 200 feet across, so it was a big place. And they're all seated in bleachers, and Gorbachev was speaking. It was, I think, the 75th or maybe the 50th anniversary, 75th, I guess, of Lenin. Lenin's statue's behind him. Now, Russians don't like communism. I quoted a general. The highest-ranking officer who defected to the West was a general. I can't think of his name. It'll occur to me. He wrote a book in which he said, we didn't have the technology to put missiles in Cuba. We don't have the missiles to use them today even. So they did. And here's my explanation, the best I can do. The conspiracy, the people that funded Lenin's revolution got concessions. Like the Harrimans got all the railroads to rebuild the railroads, and only the Harrimans got the railroads. The oil business was given to the Rockefellers, and maybe the Rothschilds. I think it was only the Rockefellers, I remember. So they had the exclusive right to develop the oil wells. And others were given certain specific franchises, concessions. Now, those people don't want to have their property nuked in a nuclear war, do they? So they're not going to let the Russians build the atomic bomb. Go back to the 50. There were 5,000 of all the top communists from a part of the nation, including the Politburo, probably 200 of their members, in one building at one time. One general with a nuclear weapon who knew that the Russian people hated communism, but they had no way to resist. They lost the right to keep and bear arms probably back in the middle of the revolution or before the revolution. So the only tool they could use was the nuclear weapon. One general with the courage who must have known how to program it to make it a small detonation could launch one missile and nuke Gorbachev and 5,000 communists, including the entire Politburo, in one moment. And then come in riding into wherever city, Moscow, and get on the radio or television and said, listen, ladies and gentlemen, I'm General so-and-so from the Russian army. I'm the one that launched the nuke that killed Gorbachev and all of those communists, and communism is over. We're going to go to capitalism. And he would have been hailed as the greatest Russian of all time because they hate the system.
You know what? We're coming to the end of this segment here, and I'm going to tell you, amongst all the mind-blowing stuff that I saw in this documentary, because you have spent a couple of shows talking about 9/11 and the theories behind what actually happened. In this, I found out that in 1947, I believe, that when we were conducting tests over the Bikini Islands, it was either that or one of the other chains, they sent, I can't remember the operation, but they sent 3 remote-controlled bombers in to take pictures of the explosion when it happened and all the devastation, blah, blah, blah. The point being, they had remote control. They had the ability to remote control planes in 1947. I mean, most people that would probably go over their head, but for me, it just was like a 2x4 hitting me in the head. It was like 1947, they had the ability, because in the documentary, it's not like they made a big deal out of it. It was like, yes, and the U.S. Air Force sent 3 remote-controlled, I forgot the bombers, what they were, remote-controlled bombers into, and I'm like, what? What?
Yes, I know.
Anyway, we'll have to leave it on that note, but that just, that's opening up a whole nother can of worms there for another hour right
yes,
there.
You bet.
But
this
Ralph,
story
I
is
just
enormous.
want you to tell people how they can get a hold of you before I let you leave, my friend.
Well, you're very kind, Chris. Once again, you're very kind to allow me to talk about this stuff. And generally, you just give me permission to go with it, and you hope that I'm going to say what it's. I think you know that I'm saying what I believe to be true because I've documented it. And all of this, most of this stuff I talked about today is in the Unseen Hand. If you want to read that book, I would highly recommend it. But first of all, go to eBay and type in the Unseen Hand in the search bar, and then go to the end where it says books. Click on books, and then read the reviews. Just read the reviews. These are what people freely wrote about the Unseen Hand, the best history book I've ever read. Everyone in America should read this book. This is the clearest, easiest read the book I've ever seen. Comments like that I had nothing to do with except write the book. eBay, the Unseen Hand. My website, if you want to buy a copy, is www.ralph, R-A-L-P as in Petunia, H, R-A-L-P-H, and then there's a dash, not the underline, the dash, Epperson, E-P-P as in Peter, E-R-S-O-N, N as in Nancy, .com. Go there and just, if you do nothing else, just browse. And by the way, it's up to 375, I think, 1,000 hits on that thing, going up every day. Still been up there since 1996. People are still going there to review it, look at it, and comment, and let me know they're buying from me. So please do that. If you want to talk to me on Facebook, I'm Ralph Epperson. Find me, go to Messenger, talk to me, call me. My phone number's listed on my website. Call me anytime you want, except at 3 o'clock in the morning. Although, even then, I'll answer the phone. I'm by myself. I'm single, so I'll answer the phone. I get phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning once in a while, and I answer them. So please, just keep in touch. I'll do what I can to assist if you have any questions or comments. And once again, Chris, I can't thank you enough. You've been very generous and very kind with me to give me the chance to expound these ideas, which are very, very controversial at the very least, I would say. Thank you so very much.
It is my pleasure, and I say God bless and keep you and give you strength and health so that, Lord willing, we can have you back on next Monday.
Thank you very much, Chris. God bless you, too. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye. All right, folks, that is our venerable, can't even speak right now, our historian, Ralph Epperson, and he is getting a lot of hits as far as the keywords people are interested in. He has a lot to say, and we need to take advantage of this man's knowledge while we have it. He's not a young man, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to him and glean from him the work that he has. I mean, this has been his life's work, and he has done a great service to mankind and Americans in particular.